Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. Today we're exploring whether Canada is experiencing what's known as the Great Resignation and asking whether the nonprofit sector is still seen as a desirable career path. Or has burnout and inequitable workplaces caused a large exodus from the sector and high turnover, especially at the leadership level? Joining me today is Deborah Legrove, president of crawfordconnect. Deborah leads her team to help employers recruit talent exclusively for the nonprofit and charitable sector. Welcome, Deborah, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Mary.
So, Deborah, you have an important perspective on the sector. In your opinion, and from what you've seen or experienced, is the nonprofit sector in Canada currently facing a great resignation?
Well, we certainly, you would think if you open up any newspaper, you'd think that we are. But really, I think that's more the influence in the U.S. I think we're definitely seeing a transition. There's no question about that in Canada. I can't speak to specific numbers, but I can tell you that as a company, crawfordconnect has never been busier. As a matter of fact, we are overloaded in some cases, and that is attributed to just people resigning for a variety of reasons, but moving on to new roles as well. But I think there's a lot of contributing factors, Mary.
So maybe you could describe what those contributing factors are. What trends are you seeing in terms of this kind of turnover or this resignation?
Well, I think the first thing that I see is that we've got a lot of people retiring. We do see burnout at the very high end of the leadership level. So just to set sort of the stage a little bit, crawfordconnect places leaders exclusively in the nonprofit sector, as you said. About 75% of our work is working with nonprofit boards to place new executive directors and CEOs. So what we are seeing with those executive directors at the top end is that they're just kind of done. They have all of a sudden, with the onset of the pandemic, they're being required to work in a whole new way. And they're just decided that's it. So I'm leaving. So that's one of the contributing factors. I also see that we have a lot of people who are what I would call job shopping. So we have candidates calling us and saying, I'm really happy in my job now, but what else have you got out there? So we're seeing a lot of that. And that's why I'm saying that people aren't necessarily resigning, but they are looking for what else is out there. There are also, the nonprofit sector, even prior to the pandemic, had a supply and demand problem. We did not have enough nonprofit leaders to fill all the positions. And we actually did a white paper on this exact issue in 2019 called Rising to the Challenges, where we really focused in on what is going on within the sector itself. And what we learned is that compensation's an issue. We learned that career progression is a challenge because a lot of people at the leadership level were hanging on to their positions and not moving. We now see today, of course, that the ramifications of the pandemic is remote working. People are job shopping to see, can I get a better deal? So that's contributing as well to what we're seeing. But the supply and demand problem already existed prior to any of the pandemic world happening.
Right. So I guess in some respects, it's an interesting time because, as you've noted, with the pandemic happening as it has, a lot of people who would have been hanging on to their leadership roles for a longer period of time have suddenly said, "Well, I just don't have it in me anymore. I just don't want to take this on anymore." And their work life would have changed so dramatically, potentially within the pandemic, depending on what subsector that they're in. Is that, am I understanding you correctly?
Yes. And it also required them to learn new skills. So as you and I are sitting here having this conversation, prior to the pandemic, we might have been doing this in a studio, but some people who were hanging on to their jobs, who were in leadership positions, didn't want to learn the new skills, didn't want to be isolated. They still wanted to go to the office. And for some of them, they just didn't want to do it anymore. And you still had the same everyday challenges that you'd experience in a nonprofit sector, where people were overworked anyway. People are always overworked in the nonprofit sector. So there's a lot going on there.
Right. And did you see that, excuse me, did you see that some subsectors or specific demographics were most impacted in this change?
Well, demographics, certainly people who are at the top end of their career and with only a few years to go, certainly those leadership levels, yes, people are taking earlier retirements. When I alluded earlier to the job shopping, I'm seeing that more people in their 20s and 30s are really just looking for, okay, I want more. I want more money. I want more flexibility in my job. I want a better title. So they are looking. I've seen that more in those age groups.
So, Deborah, I wonder if you could give me some insight into when we're looking at the exit of leaders, how perhaps we can take a look at that in a more positive light. I mean, is it a time of renewal for the sector that we should be embracing? What are your thoughts around that, or at least your observations?
I would actually agree with you, Mary, that I do see it as a positive. I've watched for many different organizations that we've worked with where we're replacing a very long-term executive director who may have been in the role 30 and sometimes I've seen 40 years. And you can just imagine that if someone was working as the direct report to that executive director, waiting for that person to retire, hopefully, and they've been waiting forever, and you end up losing that talent because they're not going to wait forever. So I do see that this is a really important positive move and will help us to open up this sector and to give those, if not emerging leaders or people who are already in leadership positions, but the chance to take over and to step into these roles. We need that desperately in this sector. I think we need some new talent.
So it can be a moment of renewal, ironically, in this pandemic, that the Great Resignation also leads to a new beginning.
Absolutely. Yes, I see it very positively, like you.
And I guess I'm curious as to whether you see this kind of resignation. You do seem to support this idea that there are a large number of leaders who didn't want to do the adaptation that they had to do to be able to continue to work through the pandemic and all the changes it required of them. And that there has been, perhaps not as great, but still a significant resignation in Canada?
Yes. The leaders that are resigning or retiring are giving shorter notice periods. So prior to the pandemic, we saw leaders giving 1 year, 2 years to their boards of directors. And now I've seen a lot less, 6 months, which is not a lot of time for a board to plan for its next leadership change. So yeah, very much so.
So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on the impact of what is being called a burnout epidemic in the nonprofit sector. What have you seen in your work, and how is it impacting recruitment and talent attraction?
So I'm going to go back and repeat something I've already said. The nonprofit sector is well known for having this sort of hero mentality that the more hours you put in, the more dedicated you are to your cause. So what happens with that is that if a leader is putting all these hours into their job and burning out, staff are following their leaders. They're they're doing exactly the same thing. So they think, hey, I worked all weekend, I did. And the problem is that people don't always recognize that they are burnt out. So when I'm working with client organizations, I can see it. I can see the burnout because you can hear it in the attitude, you can hear it in just, every day they're overwhelmed with the problems of every day. So it's a trickle down effect, quite frankly. It's if the leader is burnt out, then everyone else is burnt out. And what I like to see is and encourage organizations to start to celebrate the time off. And we have the new legislation coming in June, I believe, the right to disconnect. And I think that that's going to at least help us to get to helping people with not only developing the policies, but giving people permission to disconnect and having the conversations that need to happen with your team. And to be able to say, there's no working this weekend, everybody. We're all taking a break. I'm taking a break, and I don't want anybody. I want to see everybody else taking a break. So I'm hoping that that will help with the burnout that we are seeing, and hopefully starting to have more realistic expectations of our staff.
Yeah, that's a really an extremely important point. The fact that the government in this moment would have recognized this need, which I think even nonprofits were just beginning to dawn on them that they can't work this way that they have previously. As you've said, in this hero mentality that burnout means the end, and eventually to most people's capacity to be able to continue to deliver on their missions, and just how broad an impact that can have on the sector at large and the organizations that they're in. I wonder whether you could perhaps provide other tips that organizations could keep in mind to help them understand how to recruit staff in the coming months or later this year as we struggle through Omicron.
Yeah, that's interesting. So when we wrote our white paper a couple of years ago, we tried to include in that some tips for helping organizations to really understand what staff were looking for. And even today, staff are becoming much more discerning. Candidates who made a decision to make a move are being very, very careful about where they're going. And so if I had advice to give to employers, I would say make sure that you really pay attention to retention, retaining the staff that you have, having conversations with them, having weekly calls individually, treating them as an individual. I know that sounds very, very basic, but people want to be recognized for what they've given. And because people are feeling so disconnected today, they want the attention. So that's part of it, is not just recognizing the contribution, but staying connected on a one-to-one basis as best you possibly can. People working in nonprofits today are at very high risk for being recruited away from their job. And they will go to a new job if they're promised 20% more pay. But that doesn't mean they're going to a better organization and that the culture is going to be right for them. It just means, oh, this is attractive, 20% more pay. So really paying attention to retaining the team that you have and celebrating their successes is going to be really important. Giving them the opportunities to develop and grow, giving them the educational opportunities. They want to see what's ahead for them in their next job. What's their career progression look like? And so give them that opportunity, have that conversation about what would you like to do next. Another is sort of job swapping. Give somebody the opportunity to work with a colleague and switch jobs if you can. That's not always the case. You can't always do that, but it's a great way to recognize what an employee has given to your organization.
Right, and also job sharing, for example, if people need to step back and take a little bit of time for themselves during this very stressful time.
And encouraging them to do that, yes.
Right. I'd like to go back to the question of DEI. And I mean, I've heard anecdotally that I guess DEI initiatives or the lack thereof in the nonprofit sector in many organizations is also contributing to burnout and people just saying, I've had enough. I'm leaving. Have you seen that, or even anecdotally within your work with nonprofits?
I haven't seen it, not in a big way, no. What I have seen is organizations struggling to meet that requirement. So if one of the nonprofits that I work with has all of a sudden instituted a new DEI requirement, the managers get very, very frustrated because they want to hire for skills, and sometimes the balance is tipped in favor of DEI. Not to say that everybody isn't, qualified, but you also want to make sure that you've got the best quality candidate that you're putting forward. So I haven't seen a lot of people just saying, no, I'm not going to adapt to this. I've just seen a lot of people saying, wow, boy, this is one more requirement, one more thing I have to do. And that's a challenge.
And of the people that you see departing, are any of them people who may be people of color or in an underrepresented group saying, look, I'm tired of waiting for these DEI initiatives. I'm tired of addressing inequities within the workplace. I've heard that from anecdotally, but also from other individuals that I've spoken to on this subject. And I'm just curious whether you've come across anything like that.
I have seen that with females mostly, waiting for the top job and not being able to progress. And then a board comes in and says, okay, we're going to have a search. And yes, anybody can apply and they'll consider, but they still hire externally. When you've got someone who's already been groomed internally, they're part of the succession plan, and yet the board makes the decision to hire externally. I've seen that taking place, but not necessarily from it's somewhat of a different race.
Right. Okay. So I guess you raise a very interesting point. I don't know that the nonprofit sector is known to be very skillful or in preparing a great deal for succession planning. Do you think that's accurate, or do you see that organizations are really have that as part of their plan?
I'm laughing at this, Mary, because we offer succession planning as one of our services. And I have yet to see anyone really take hold and develop the superior succession plans. We can talk about it. I see some organizations now where their boards of directors are quite sophisticated, and they are insisting on it of their CEOs and their executive directors. And so when we get brought in to hire maybe at a VP level, our job is to make sure that this group is our potential successors for CEOs. But it's still not, it should be forefront in everyone's mind. And it's unfortunate that it isn't.
Right. I mean, because it certainly is in the for-profit sector. I mean, their succession planning is key to business planning, and certainly, I would say, a major concern for boards as well. So what can we learn from the for-profit sector that the nonprofit sector should be doing in this area, particularly now that we are thinking about having more diverse leadership? How can we use succession planning to achieve that more effectively? Or do you think it has a role?
It absolutely has a role. And I think as a board, I sit on a board, and I know that this is part of a regular conversation at our board table. I don't know that it's a regular part of the conversation at all board tables. So that's the first thing. It has to be discussed at the board table. The second is that you have to be able to get to a place with the board to have an open dialogue with your executive director or CEO. Very often, those are the biggest barriers to having that conversation. The CEO thinks, oh, why? I'm not doing a good job, or I'm not doing a good enough job. You have to be able to get past that and look at it as a risk to an organization. So those are the first two things. Then just take one step at a time and having those conversations. Then you start to think about the third step, which is, who do we have on our team that we can groom for this role, or we can start to educate, and where are we going to put our professional development dollars? Those are the first three things that an organization can do immediately without even having a succession plan on paper. But those are the things that you have to be purposeful about taking those steps.
And I'd love to know whether, from your perspective, and whether anything's changed since the pandemic hit in 2020 to now, is the nonprofit sector seen as a meaningful and desirable career choice as it might have been in a different way in 2019? Have you seen a change in terms of attitudes towards the sector as a great place to work?
I don't know that I've seen a change necessarily, Mary. People still want meaningful work. That hasn't changed. But I think if anything, the pandemic has taught us that people want it even more so today. I think that, people who have been in jobs that necessarily didn't provide them with that satisfaction are starting to look elsewhere. And that might be contributing to this transition. And that's why I think they're out there job shopping. They're looking for, okay, what else? I need something that is, going where I can use my skills and transfer my skills. So it's open. We have to be open to it. I also think that it's always been a desirable goal. I just think people start their work careers. They want to get the first job. They want to get the second job. They want to get the third job. And then by the time they see, okay, boy, I've done all this. Now I want to do something that's meaningful for me. So I think it's part of a mentality as you grow in your career.
And we've heard quite a bit lately about, in fact, there's been a report from the YMCA around the need for employers to show and provide flexibility to workers, particularly after the impact of COVID, as a key part of the value proposition of working for that organization or that employer. Would you agree? Is that what you're seeing as well from the feedback you get from your clients?
Absolutely. First question, and this comes from candidates that we speak with. The first question when we're on the phone with them, is this a remote working opportunity or a hybrid? And that's where we have to have the conversation with our clients to say, life is changing. And if you want the strongest pool of candidates, that's something you need to consider. But that absolutely is flexible working, however you want to call it, remote working opportunity. I think people still have a need to want to get together. They still want to see each other face to face, but I do believe that we'll see a lot more in the office 3 days a week or 2 days a week, or as meetings need to take place. People aren't willing to move as much anymore either. We're working on a position right now for downtown Toronto, and it used to be very, very easy to fill those positions. But when you have a very specific need and a very specific expertise that you're looking for, you can only look within the GTA. You can't start to look outside of the GTA anymore because people are moving out of the GTA. They're not moving into the GTA.
So true. What can organizations do to appeal to professionals who may be looking for more meaning in their career? So that idea that, yes, the nonprofit sector is this place where one goes to find meaning and purpose. How do we make that proposition clear to potential candidates?
You know, this is where organizations can get really creative. They might not, or nonprofits might not be able to compete with a for-profit compensation, but there are a whole host of other things that they can do. Offering more vacation time, offering more professional development. You can, the career progression path itself, to show them, okay, you know, if you spend 2 years in this job, then here's the next one. You have to be able to communicate that as a way to add that value proposition to candidates. But there's so much more that can be done. You can also emphasize the cause itself. I mean, if you're in a nonprofit and you are raising funds for the homeless, for example, you want to be able to attract somebody who really sees the value in that. So you want to be able to share that opportunity in the best possible way. You know, I think of organizations that I've worked with who got so creative with, you know, not only the work from home prior to the pandemic, but childcare and contributing to childcare, signing bonuses. Now we're seeing hilarious that we're now seeing signing bonuses to lure people to come into some of these roles. So there's lots of different options to attract them.
Well, Deborah, I wonder if you have any final words of advice that you might want to give to actually organizations who may be facing this potential resignation among their staff members. What do you tell them could help them in this turbulent time?
I think I'm going to go back to what I talked about earlier, Mary, and that is take the pulse of your current team. Have conversations with them. Find out, if you can, find out where they're at. Really focus on retaining your current team and find out what they want. What are their goals? I think that you've already trained those people. They already know your organization. So make sure that you're really looking after them first. Then the secondary is if you still have to recruit, then start to think about what can you offer potential employees coming to the table. And a lot of it is the people that work in nonprofit, they're already sold about working in nonprofit. You don't have to speak to their heart as much because they're already there for a reason. It's what else can you offer them that they can, to keep them working in this particular sector over the long term, so that we're avoiding some of the things that we've talked about today, the burnout and so forth. What does the long-term plan look like?
Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Mary.